Hey, so we're in the basic weapons tutorial, and what we're going to do is complete it as quickly as possible, and then just fly around and try to do some cool stuff, and hopefully not blow up while doing it. Well, right now, I have my doors open back here, so let's get those shut. And let's get our plane turned on. Put main battery on. Fire up the auxiliary power. Once that gets up to speed, we can flip on engine 1. You gotta let engine 1 settle before you do engine 2. Okay, engine 1 has settled. Engine 2 is on. We're gonna turn on our MFDs. Put this one on equip, this one on targeting pod. We have to supply power to it. And then hit the SOI so we can control it with our thumbstick here. Over here, we're going to put on the nav. Turn on our HMCS and our HUD. Personal preferences, I'm going to turn on internal lights and off G-limit. Alright, and put my visor on, and we're ready to fly. So we're going to tilt our engines to a point behind us and taxi up to this runway here. So, brake block off. Should probably turn off my auxiliary power. Alright, and let's crank some tunes on and get flying. Landing gear up. We'll turn that back on later. We'll, the narrator's about to come on and basically tell us where our targets are. We're gonna have to blow up some tanks down here. And keep an eye on my fuel. Plenty of fuel.
Now that we're in the area of operations, you can enable the master arm switch. With the weapon system armed, you'll see some new icons on the heads-up display. At the center, you have the weapon targeting reticle, or pipper. Up here, you have weapon type, name, and shots remaining. You can cycle through all the armed weapons by pressing the button on the joystick. These unguided weapons can be fired simply by pulling the trigger on the joystick. You have limited stores, so save your rounds for the targets. Let's try deploying the GAU-8 on some ground targets. In a moment, you'll receive a mission objective. You can auto-slew your TGP to the objective waypoint by pressing the waypoint button in the TGP screen. Go ahead and destroy the tanks at the objective waypoint.
Landing gear. Landing gear. Landing gear. Landing gear. Landing gear. Landing gear. Altitude.
Start working on our targeting pod. Got one locked. We're gonna crank our throttle all the way down.
Landing gear.
So we start descending.
Shoot.
Oh, I have missiles on. Whoops. I was supposed to do with the other one. the machine gun to go. It's okay. Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no. Lost focus there for a second. Let's get spun around on this last one, take it out, and then go get the other 3 tanks on the other side.
Great job. Now let's work with rockets.
Autopilot disengaged.
Hydra 70s are small, unguided rockets. By default, each pull of the trigger will fire 1 rocket. However, they can be configured to launch rapidly. This is called ripple firing. To access a weapon's config menu, set the equipment MFD page to config mode. Then select the weapon you want to configure. If you have multiple of the same weapon type mounted, try setting the rockets to different ripple intervals and destroy the next set of targets.
Shoot.
Miss. Got one. I'll flip around real quick and go do some fun stuff. Our targeting pod on this guy over here. A little wonky here. Little wonky.
Shoot.
Shoot. That might have to have done it though. We got one more bad guy over here.
Shoot. Shoot. Shoot.
Got
Well
him.
done. You've destroyed all of the targets. This concludes the basic weapons tutorial.
We are going to continue our flight. Alright, well let's fly around and have some fun. Try not to get blown up. City over there. We're gonna play around these mountains first, then we'll get up in the city.
Pull up. Altitude. Pull up. Altitude. 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 Pull up. Altitude.
31 feet off the ground.
Altitude. 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 Pull up. Altitude. 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 Altitude.
surprised when that blew up. Game's pretty defensive. Much cleaner. Alright, let's try to land on top of one of these buildings and call it a success. Did not mean to do that. Put our landing gear down. Brake lock on, so whenever we do land, we don't go rolling off the side. Well, we did it. Alright, so let's get off the building in the most fun way possible. By ejecting. Not the most clean landing, but it didn't fall off, so that's good. Alright, call good.